Okay, attention audience. The next presentation will be delivered by a team of two. One is a long-time Access developer and former member of the Microsoft Access team, who today interrupted his quest for the perfect ale to sing a song on adding features to the Access development environment. He is accompanied on rhythm guitar by an infamous Access swashbuckler and long-term MVP and our dear conference organizer. Please give it up for Kevin Bell and Karl Donnerbauer.
Thank you, Philip. Nice to meet you. Well, we're at the last session for today, and it's we called it Click Here to Add Feature X because we don't have a name for the whole project. It could also have been named NuGet for Access or Access Tool Manager, Organizer, Components Manager, Organizer. That's one of the questions. It's mainly about questions today. We want to know what's your interest, want to show you something, and ask you also for a title for the whole thing. And the first thing is show you an example of what we are imagining here. I don't like Outlook, and I use Thunderbird as a mail client. And it's a good mail client, but it has some deficiencies. I want to have some better features, other features. And with Thunderbird, that's an easy thing because there's a huge community that builds these features. And if we have a look on this tool menu here, there's a point that says add-ons and themes, but mainly it's about add-ons. And if I open them, I go to an add-on manager that's built in Thunderbird. And you see the three add-ons that I have currently installed here. That's one for mail marches. That's where you get the mails for the conference. The quick text, that's for prepared text that I can send out, and the reply with header for better header answers, etc. And if I want to know more about this mail march, for example, I click on here and I get another menu with details like a help file, how to use all the things here. And I get some options. I get permissions, I get the release notes, all the things that happened in all the versions. And and I could remove it here. And I could also disable them, etc. And if I'm looking for another feature for Thunderbird, I'm just, let's say I'm looking something for signatures, and I get to a website. So that's addonthunderbird.net, and I get some tools for signatures to do better signatures. And if I click on that, I get user reviews. Obviously, a lot of people have downloaded that and use it. I can read all these reviews. I get a lot of details. What does it cost? What does it do? Etc. etc. And I can simply install it by clicking on Add to Thunderbird. And it's the fourth one in my list here. So that would be the 100% solution, and we will not get it in Access, but that would be the dream that we have. So that you have a sample what's possible. And now let's come to the reality again with Access. Access is just 30 years old, 30 and a half. This is from the Walk of Fame on the Microsoft campus in October 92. So it's an old product and it has some problems. That's a part of our motivation. I'm talking about motivation now. That's the situation of Access. And it's not the best, the general situation. We are Windows and desktop and compound. Our technologies are outdated. We don't have web and mobile capabilities. You know, everything, they got it wrong. IT departments hate us because we don't have administration tools, we don't have real security features, and the young people don't see Access in schools or wherever, so we don't get fresh blood into the Access area and development. Instead, we get a lot of update bugs, instability, there's a trust crisis, and since 20 years or so, we have test rumors and a bad image. You know all this. I just want to give you a picture of there are some problems for the product. And it continues like this because it's not only about having some image problems. There are real problems like modern technologies and modern demands of people nowadays, like mobile, like getting data everywhere, other form factors, etc. And that's why the market for desktop databases generally is declining in the last 20 years, and also the market for access. So and another problem is that for Microsoft, Access is not really a very important product. I mean, the resources are very low. You saw the almost complete Access team, I fear. There are some very few features. I come to that point, and there is almost no PR. So, and no improvements are to be expected in all these areas. Let's first summarize the new features that we got in the last 2 years. I picked the last 2 years. I could have picked a much longer period. I picked when there was feature complete for Access 2021, because it came out in September 21, but a few months before, there's a cut in the features of 365 that they then put out as a perpetual version, and that's a feature complete date, so it's almost 2 years now. And what did we get since then? One feature, the Dataverse connector. Last year, we had a complete session about that, but it's very doubtable if there is a mass usage of this feature. So this is one major feature, but I don't know about the usage. One feature. Second feature, a little feature that was overdue 15 years, code signing. It came out in January now. So we are at number 2. And then we are at number 3, that bigger feature again that comes out in April. We will see how usable it is in practice. So we are at count number 3 in 2 years. And that's really isn't much, 3 features in more than 2 years. Because there was a big change in Microsoft's feature strategy 10 years ago, and not 6, 7 years at least, when it was completed, this feature strategy. In former times, we had major releases every 2 to 4 years, like Office 2003, 2007, 10, 13. And then after that, we got the continuous delivery. They do the same thing that companies do for mobile apps, etc. They are trying to deliver new features every week, every month, or every 2 months, whatever interval they have. And I often hear when I discuss with colleagues, Access colleagues, the meaning that we don't need no new features. We would be lucky if they just would keep it stable, make it stable. And I think this is wrong, because if you get a few new features, a product is essentially dead nowadays, because there are some principles and some problems with the features. There's a software entropy, and software just rots without sufficient care and new features. And Access is behind technologically, as you saw, hopefully in the last points. And there's even in the market an intensified technological and feature change, also concerning features. Also at Microsoft, I mean, people compare every product with other products, like we don't need to compare it with the Power Platform, where you get a new feature every minute or so, but just compare it with Excel. It's even older than Access, more than 30 years, and gets a ton of features every month and every year. And people see this. I mean, we had 3 new features in more than 2 years, and Excel gets that in a few weeks. So that doesn't look very good for Access. What can we do about this? We can maybe, and that's our goal today, we can use third-party provider tools so that the community can step in. That's what we want to talk about today. Talking about third-party tools, there are hundreds for Access out, and the biggest link page for Access is a German one by Raphael Hein, who is an attendee today. And nobody knows how to pronounce it. I think he pronounced it Yaccess.com, but I suggested to him it could be Yaccess.com, I don't know. Let's go quickly to the website. When I talk of hundreds of tools, Raphael has a count of 202 here on his website, and that's just the English and German market, because I know Italian tools, I know Brazilian tools, etc. There are hundreds more out in the world. but Raphael already has more than 200 on his page in different categories. So, for example, there are search and replace tools. Of course, number one is Phil's search and replace tool. Is my audio okay, Phil? Just in between?
Yes, mostly okay.
Okay, I'll continue. Yeah, there are many tools on this page in all different categories. And there's also a category tool vendors. And Raphael has 18 here. And again, it's just a part of the real market. There are other countries out, and maybe we have a 20 to 30, I would mean access halfway or real professional tool vendors in the access market. Yeah, there is again, for example, FMS is the biggest player here, the biggest company in the access market, and several others. So we can talk about 2030, I would say. So this just is a quick look that there are really hundreds out, because not everybody knows that. And yeah, all kinds of tools, editors for anything, analysis tools, obfuscators, image handlers, JSON things, some in the form of ActiveX tools and some for the VBE. You may know many of them, but there are hundreds out, and I just named a few here. So there are really many third-party tools out, and the access tool providers, as I said, maybe 20 plus, quite professional vendors, but there are also countless individual providers. I mean, every developer can develop some component, some class module that does a special trick. That would be a small tool again, and there are thousands, hundreds of thousands out who can do that. In the access market, we don't have big players. I mean, FMS is the biggest company, and he doesn't have 100 employees or so. It's a small company relatively, and most people here are single persons or two persons, maybe in small companies. So they don't have advertising budgets, and they are difficult to find. The tools are difficult to find often, and also the vendors. And they are inconsistent. I mean, they all have different concepts, how their tools work, how they are to install, how they are documented, how you get them, etc. And some goals of our talk today and of this initiative could be to increase the market opportunities for these vendors, for the access market, to give them an incentive, also an incentive for standardization, at least to a certain extent, and generally said to do a boost for the access market and some innovation. And now, Kevin, bring them to the ground again. Take over.
Thank you, Karl. Let me share my screen. I assume everybody can see this. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Hopefully, Karl got bit by the demo gods and not me. So hopefully things will go a little smoothly. So yeah, so what is Feature X? Well, we kind of see it as a set of community developed and supported features or tools for access, all stored in a central location. It's easy to find with a search right from within Access, so you can find something you want and add it. It's got friction-free installation and updates for those features. There's a wide variety of libraries and tools and add-ins. And unfortunately, this is vaporware right now. So as Karl alluded to, this is all kind of just a lot of hand waving, and wouldn't it be great if we did something like this? Most other languages and tools have some kind of concept of a package manager, which makes it easy to find an add-in or a reference library. And Access should have one as well. So again, this is all about possibilities to kind of gauge the interest of, the general population out there, and kind of see if people are going to use it and see if there's interest in help building out something like this. I saw a lot of new names, at least new names to me in the conference, so I just threw on a real quick slide. I've been using Access since kind of day one, SQL Server since Access 2.0, ran a small consulting company, had a midlife crisis, went to work for Microsoft, been a frequent presenter. I'm now actually working for a consulting company that builds equity compensation. So it's a completely different kind of space for me. Anyways, Karl and I agree on a lot of things, but we agree to disagree on when Axis actually turned 30. He had it end of October. I have it November, and I have documented proof because on the 13th of November, we got together with some current and former Axis team members at a local
I have it on stone. I have it graved in stone.
Yeah, I got it on a cake. And look,
Oh.
would everybody have shown up if it wasn't Axis's birthday? So we'll have to agree to disagree. But as Karl said, it is a very mature product, but it's been very successful. And this is kind of my take on why Axis was successful. It really was the first and, arguably maybe the only database for the masses, assuming you don't count Excel as a database. And that success is because it was part of Office. It also had a very low kind of bar for entry. If you remember back, the templates and the wizards let you ramp up very quickly and build something. But I think the thing that made it really kind of have 30 years of longevity was the high ceiling. At Microsoft, we would call this kind of the dev continuum, where you can start here and kind of move your way up the proverbial food chain. So for example, if the tables became too limited, you could move to SQL Server. If you ran out of kind of runway on the macros, you could switch to VBA code, and that would open up a whole myriad of different things you can do, including Windows API calls and things like that. One of my favorite kind of expressions is good, fast, cheap, pick two. You've probably heard of this in other forms of the iron triangle or the project management trial or triple constraints. There's a lot of other kind of variations. One of my favorite is strong, light, cheap, pick two. And that was coined by a mountain bike pioneer in the 80s. I like to think Axis can be good, fast, and cheap. I think it can be all three in the hands of the right developer. And I think that's why it's been so successful. Anybody here that does any kind of .NET or kind of, more scalable programming realizes you can do it in Axis in probably a third to a fifth the time. So what's the state of Axis today? It's pretty clear the primary focus, as Karl said, is in making, kind of minor improvements to the designers, putting the X button on the tab. There has been a lot of, data support that's been added over the years. But from my standpoint, it's, what are things that help you make a better application? And I really have two or maybe three of these things that seem to be kind of new features, not just slight revisions on something else or something that an end user would never see. Us as a developers, the new link table manager, okay, that might be great, but your end user is not going to use that. So I see the modern charts, maybe Dataverse, and then the kind of upcoming web browser controls as really the only new features in the last, well, probably close to 10 years that let you build something better that your end user is going to go, wow, that's really cool. The move to 365 was bumpy and maybe still is a bit. I think it's getting better. It seems when a bug would get hit in the early days of 365, it might be weeks before something was pushed out. Now they can flip a switch and maybe you have to restart Axis and it goes back to the existing behavior. The Axis web apps were deprecated not too long after they showed up, and effectively we had 2 cycles of Axis where there wasn't a lot of development because it was all Axis web app or future releases. And then for me personally, I find VBA just an absolute dinosaur. If you use any kind of modern IDE, there are so many benefits, and it's really like you're living in the dark ages when you use VBA. And for me personally, it's becoming harder and harder to push Axis as a front end for new projects, unless of course that's all you can do with a budget. But I'd like to see that kind of change. So what can we do? Well, I think we have to assume that Microsoft's not going to make any significant changes to the funding for Axis, and kind of what we've seen for the last 5 or 10 years is probably what is going to have for the next 5 or 10 years. So it's time for the community to kind of really step up and, I think, look at building some of these new features or tools, or at least getting existing tools into a format that people can easily find. And we would love to have Microsoft support, don't get me wrong, but I don't think we should count on it at all. So what is a package manager? And that's kind of, Karl showed it with his Thunderbird or whatever his email client was. I like to see it from a developer standpoint. I think it's a collection of tools that automate the process of managing kind of external shared libraries. I originally pitched this idea at, I think it was the first DevCon in 2017 as NuGet for Access. And the response that back then was actually a bit kind of tepid. You know, it wasn't like, oh, well, let's go do this. It was like, okay, that's great, but I don't know that we really need it. Some of the challenges we're going to have with this is, you know, Access kind of has this monolithic design, which is great. It's just one big file. But unlike other languages, it doesn't have any namespacing. So I think we're going to have some challenges with conflicts and stuff. But that aside, you know, it's software, right? We can solve anything. Let's look at a couple package managers. And the first one I want to show, let me pull over, is the actual NuGet for Access. So this is, oh, that's the wrong one. I apologize. So this is Visual Studio, and we can get to the NuGet package manager by going up to Tools, and then Package Manager, and then there's the Package Manager for the solution. And if I open this up, it'll show me what I have currently installed, and this is a very simple demo that actually doesn't do anything. And the only package I've referenced is the Azure blob storage. But I can browse for anything. So if I want to look for other Access, or let's say let's look for Azure packages, you can see there's Azure Core, there's Key Vaults, all sorts of things that are Azure related. If I click on this here, I can select whatever solution I want in the project and install. This is actually giving me a warning on this one because I have one that's a little out of date for the blobs. And if I hover over this, it says this package has a vulnerability with moderate severity. So it's recommending that I upgrade. Again, I could just click on this package, select here and say I want to update, and I can pin whatever version I want. It's hinting me that the 12.16 release is the more stable release. Now, you can also find this on the website. So let me, there it is. Flip over to the NuGet, and you can see there's a ton of packages and a ton of downloads, but I can search here as well. So if I just search for blob, you can see the first one showed up as the Azure blob storage, and it gave me a little summary. Now, when I started looking at this, it was only at 119 million. So there has been quite a lot of downloads in the last week or two. And if I click through here, it'll show me more information, including the command line that I could run it from the console if I wanted to avoid the UI and I just know that I want to update something. So that, in kind of a nutshell, is NuGet. Now, there's another, I've been, with my kind of new career change, been exposed to Java. And Java uses a little different, I guess, package manager. And there's a bunch of different versions. The project I'm working on is using what's called Maven, which doesn't have the glitzy UI in here, but you go in and you basically edit this XML file. And how did I get this information? Well, let me flip back over to here. Very similar. I can search for blob in the repository, and down here you can see the Azure blob storage. Oh, it's actually, that's an old one. So here's the client library for blob storage, and you can see I can pick the versions I want, and if I click in here, it gives me that XML for Maven. And in this case, it's basically saying you should be on 12.22. So all I would have to do is go in here and change 12.22. And if I did something like this, You can see it's pinned it, and then I would refresh my project and it would make sure all those libraries are pulled down. Now, it has, let me go back to this. You can see it highlights it in yellow because it's detected that same vulnerability. There are some UI effects here, but they both basically do the same thing. In fact, if I was to crack open the project file for Visual Studio, this is actually what NuGet drops in. So it's basically the exact same thing. It's just the Visual Studio has a little nice wrapper on it. But one of the important things that these both do is they actually look for reference projects. So if I were to build that .NET project, you can see it pull down the Azure storage blob, but it also was smart enough to realize it needed Azure Core and Azure Storage Common. And if there was other things, it would pull those libraries down as well. So that is kind of the quick nutshell of what a package manager is. And there's a ton of different versions, but that's kind of where we're coming from for talking about building something like this. So where can we start with this? Well, I like to, I guess, a kind of equivalence class different things we could do with Axis. And I think starting out, we could basically just have a code and a class modules that would get pulled into your application. I don't want to confuse this with a code snippet where you might copy and paste into your form. These would be modules and standalone kind of code blocks that you wouldn't ever edit. We would have to try to control those. How we do that is still up for debate. And then as you go up, we could do something with libraries where you'd actually have a compiled library that you have to set a reference to. And then, we have the DLLs and ActiveX controls that we could build and somehow tie in, or Access add-ins that you've, all kind of seen, or maybe some of the external tools. And the external tools I'm thinking of, like Phillips Find and Replace, where it's not written in Access, it kind of sits in its own ribbon space and really kind of lives on its own within Access. So these kind of accessories, they have some strengths and some challenges. I think the thing with the ActiveX and kind of those external tools is we literally have unlimited possibilities. We could do whatever we want to with it, given enough time and kind of skill. But they're a black box. They've got to be registered. You're going to have to figure out how you distribute the updates, and they're definitely harder to make from a technical standpoint. And then we have the Access libraries and add-ins, which can be pretty robust. You're not going to have the conflicts because they're all kind of in their own little standalone space. They're certainly much easier to build than, say, a DLL or a COM library. But again, they're kind of a black box. You still have to set some kind of reference or install them. And I think one of my big pet peeves for somebody who's built some add-ins is they have to be compiled on the lowest supported version of Access. So when I do that with my add-ins, I have to have a version of 2010 32-bit and a version of 2010 64-bit that are sitting on VMs or on an old laptop. Really is kind of a pain to do. And then we get to the code in class module group, which the source is open and modifiable. And that's kind of a good thing and a bad thing. I think they're also the easiest to develop. I was kind of half listening to some of the topics yesterday, and I saw in the Northwind demo, Tom talk about the kind of a string replacement utility. That might be a perfect candidate to just drop in and make one of these class modules or code modules. Again, the biggest challenge here is going to be conflicts. So we could start anywhere, and because this is just open discussion, but it seems to me that maybe the class modules might be an ideal place to start, and I'll show you an example in a second. I think one of the big takeaways is because the source is open, we don't necessarily have to have a formal review process before something gets in there. If somebody puts something up that's malicious, somebody should be able to flag it and say, hey, how come there's all these VBA kill statements in here? Or why are you sending my data to the cloud? The other thing I really like about this potential starting point is that once we get it downloaded in the application, there's nothing to worry about. There's no referencing. There's no like, do I have the right version? It's just part of your application. We obviously have to worry about kind of access version and bitness. They need to be able to work across all things, or we need to have a way to say this only works in, Access 2016 or later. And again, they have the lowest bar for creation. We would probably come up with a set of maybe guidelines so that everybody's on the same page, and there are going to have to be some kind of hooks in there so we know what version you have and should we replace it or not. And this isn't necessarily limited to code. Really anything that you can export to a text file, so forms, reports, and queries could be included in this. But I think starting with the code first makes sense. So let me show you kind of a quick example of how this could work. This is my task dialog library that I ported from John Johnson, who got a message or a call out from Mike about being very involved with the Twin Basic. So this contains only classes and codes, but you do need to import it into your own application. So let me fire up a quick sample here. And you can see there's a ton of forms and stuff in here, but that's all for the demo application. And I'm not going to show a lot of these, but if I click on these here, you can see I get a task dialog that has been around since like the Windows Vista days. But it allows you to do different things, including, let's see, progress bar. So I could actually build a progress bar while I'm doing something. And I could make this cancelable. If it's an important process, I could make a validation button. And all you really need is some of these files here. And so what I did with the demo is I ship out this version here, which only has the items you need to import. And if we open this up, you can see, okay, there's the class module that you'd have to import into your library. And then there is a GDI library that I pulled in that hasn't been updated in 15 years almost. So this is where kind of maybe the rubber meets the road, because we have this library I don't really own. I just pulled it in. So what happens if I need a version of this library and maybe Mike puts out a add-in that uses a slightly different version of this library? Well, we can't have those same files in there. So we're going to have to kind of figure out how to resolve those conflicts and things like that. But that's a solvable problem. And then I did need to have a regular module in here with just some of the things that wouldn't work in the class library. And then the last one is optional, which, maybe we have a way to say, give me sample files or not. This I created a wrapper function because I found that the very common things like I want to do a yes, no message box, or I want to throw up information. I didn't want to have to set all these properties to use the task dialog, but I wanted that same kind of modern look and feel. So I created a simple, like the message box where I just put an instruction and say what the content, and there's an optional button. So I can make a one-line call just like I would the regular message box. And then there's like an example in here where if I run this, you can actually see kind of a smorgasbord of what's possible. So when I talk about code, that's really what I'm talking about, is bringing those elements into your application, just like you'd manually have to do. But when an update is made, you'd actually see, oh, hey, there's a new version that I can pull down. Close out of this and close out of this. So we kind of talked about, what the potential issues are here. One of the things that immediately jumped out to me is how we handle kind of the public enums. That is a challenge. I don't know if we have to give them some kind of prefix or something like that, but again, it's a problem we can solve. And then, as I touched on, what about different versions of dependencies, right? We want to be able to have this kind of dependency tree so we know that, hey, I need this element or this library pulled in as well. Maybe we don't have to deal with the versioning because there's not going to be enough revisions. But you saw with the blob storage, like how many different revisions were out there. Okay, so that's kind of the mechanics of it. The last real demo I wanted to show you is what we could maybe do for an interface. I had updated my old link table manager to be 64-bit compliant. And then in the pandemic, I had some free time, so I ended up creating a click once installer, which really made it, I like to think, a first-class add-in. So similar to Philips Find and Replace, I can be on the ribbon and don't have to be buried in those, down in the add-in menu. So I did that using the Visual Studio tools for Office and created an add-in. This is written completely in C#. And this could be an entry point for like searching for packages. So, you want to give that interface kind of like NuGet had, where you just type in, I'm searching for JSON, and it would show you all the things kind of tagged with JSON. We could also notify you of updated packages. And I think we could give the ability to mark packages as favorites. So if you really like my task dialog and you want to use that in all your applications, you could kind of pin that so it's, you don't have to go search for it. You can just say, oh yeah, add this one to my library. And we could also use this for maybe submitting feedback ratings, or, hey, I think I see something that might be malicious. So I'll show you quickly what that looks like. Let me pull over this. Oh, let me do something else first. Let me spin up Access, and let me show you what the add-in looks like first. Now you can see, again, here's Philips' tool, and here's my tool sitting on the menu. You may have not noticed, but let me close this down and watch what happens. That tab goes away because there's no reason to have it open when there's not a database. So it only pops up when there's an active database, and it takes a half a second or so. The other thing that's kind of cool about this is I can actually add a context menu that talks to my add-in before the add-in is ever really loaded. Whereas before, I wouldn't see this until I went into Database Tools, Add-ins, and then launched it from the add-in. So that lets me like really kind of grab hooks inside of Access. And I've only really scratched the surface on this, but I think there's a lot of things we can do. And then when I click on one of these buttons, it's going to fire up. And for some reason, it seems to be really slow the first time it loads, even though I've set a reference to that. And you can see there's the my add-in. And this is all in here is all Access. So it's all, VBA. So now let me show you what this looks like. And you can see kind of across the top here, we've got the Access UI tools, the data source manager, and then elements. Well, there's Access UI tool. There's data source manager. So right here, I'm actually building out the ribbon. And then that button that I clicked on, let me expand this, basically wires up to this on-click event. And this on-click event is very simple. It just says run access code and then startup. So if I go look at this here, you might start to see some things that look familiar. So if you kind of ignored this globals, this add-in, application current project is trusted, you could run that in the VBA command line and it would give you true or false. So in this case, I'm checking to make sure that the project's trusted. If it's not, I'm not going to do anything. And then I call this load add-in, which is kind of the magic behind like, oh, let's go ahead and load it, but then unload it as a reference. So it's sitting in there. And then when somebody clicks on it, again, we ignore this part in the front. All I'm doing is an application run. And then I have my project name defined as Access UI Data Source Manager. I do the dot, and then the function name, which in this case is startup. So if, Philip did something like this and he had a startup and we could somehow put those icons on the screen at the same time, his startup and my startup would be, be like, okay, I know which one I'm going to start up with. So that's, exposes a lot of things and is probably a lot deeper than you can do with just kind of the VBA in Access. So we could easily add a search box here. We could have a drop down with your favorites. We could, at some stage, maybe I could do what I'm doing here behind the scenes, where we could register an ad and it would just get copied down, and we would give you kind of that first class button on there, and people could maybe rearrange it. So doing something like this, like the possibilities are really, unlimited. Okay, how are we doing on time? Oh, almost perfect. So where to begin? So I think the first step is determining if there's enough interest in having a service like this. This is a lot of work, and so really there's got to be a lot of kind of demand and involvement for this. If there is, I think we want to probably create an exploratory group to figure out what the tentative feature list is going to be and come up with a roadmap or kind of a development plan. Like I said, from the surface, I think starting with just the code and the class modules makes the most sense, but maybe not. We're still going to have to build out the whole infrastructure. Things like, where's it going to live, right? Needs to be a client that we have to build out so that we can, talk to the service and figure it out. There's just a ton of things that have to happen, and I think we could eventually add, add-ins or DLLs or whatever we wanted down the road. But I'm a big believer of walking before we try to run.
Very soon we would have to have a website for this, to collect information, to collect the tools, to link to it, etc. So there's a lot of infrastructure.
Yes, a ton. And so we need a set of skills. And I just kind of went off the top of my head of things that I think are important. And either you need to have these skills or want to learn these skills to kind of help. So project management, object-oriented programming, working with a modern IDE. We won't be writing this in VB because we're going to be sitting kind of outside of Access, but inside of Access. Most likely we'll use C#. Source code control, right? We're going to have multiple developers working on this. We need to know what went in and why something broke, or what changes were made, or how's this change going to affect the piece I'm working on. We're going to build it in the cloud because we're not going to go buy hardware. So probably Azure, it seems to make sense since we're kind of all Microsoft friendly. And then we need people to, promote it. Mike Wolf, blogs, videos, things like that, just to get people excited and know it's out there. And at some point we're going to have to fund this. I've got some Azure credits that I can use in the short term. I have no idea what this is going to cost to run. It could be, $20 a month. It could be $200. It could be $1,000 a month, depending on how it scales. So at some point, I think we're going to have to think about, monetizing this, and monetizing it from a standpoint that I'll pick on Philip again, like he might drop his find and replace tool in there, and maybe we take 10% of the sales to help fund this, because he's going to get that many more sales, and his, distributing an update is going to be just a piece of cake for him. But that's something that is going to get tabled until we kind of resolve the other things. And then, of course, we need to figure out who's going to kind of own this. And I don't mean like I own it and something, but where's it going to live? What happens if I win the lottery or get hit by the bus? It needs to be able to carry on, not just like, oh, we lost the person that was hosting all this stuff. So logistics like that. So with that, I think I am right on time. Yeah, look at that. So Karl has put together a survey here that we'd like you to kind of fill out to gauge, is this something you would consume? Are you willing to help out? If you've got the skills or want to learn the skills, I think there's a notes section.
I posted it in the chat already now.
So, yeah, and that's it. Thank you. So hopefully that's sparked a little interest, or just kind of got people excited about what might be possible.
Are there any questions, Phil?
A couple of questions. The first that came up was, why not use GitHub somehow for this endeavor?
And that's a possibility. Azure's got its own Azure DevOps that has Git in it as well. We might be able to hook into that and kind of do some automated build kind of pipeline stuff where you point to a repository and you always pull, the most current version, but it'd be nice to be able to pin a version. And so I don't know if we can do that where it's like, oh, I want to be on version 3 because, I don't trust version 4 and I don't want version 4 to come out just automatically when I'm updating and not realize there's been a change. So, and I think another reason for doing that is to kind of lower the bar. If somebody installs this add-in and they click on, oh, I want the JSON library or the task dialog library, it just pulls down. They don't have to know about Git. They don't have to, it kind of pushes that entry point down lower.
Okay. Another question was by George about funding for the project. That's something you addressed yourselves already. And the idea of taking a small cut from tool vendors came up already in the chat. And I would like to comment on that as a tool vendor, actually. And I think if it really increases demand and revenue for tools, that might be an option. But unless it really moves the needle in terms of the number of paying customers for tools, the amount will be too small to really make a difference and too small to really contribute to the funding of this project.
Yeah, that's a valid point. I think on the flip side, though, if we figure out there's a demand for this, we could handle all the payment stuff and all that kind of overhead for collecting money. So somebody coming in new that maybe has an ad and they're like, oh, I wouldn't mind getting, $10 for this. The amount of effort to go set up a way to take payments and the licensing and things like that, we could do that all behind the scenes for them. And they may just have to drop in, some blocks of code in their libraries.
And this way to get features would have to become some kind of standard, of course, to get to the masses. Well, it should be natural to install this thing if you want to work with Access. That would be the goal, of course.
Yeah, and I think that, like I said, the monetization part is way down the road. We'll have to figure out how to fund this in the short term. And like I said, I've got some Azure credits that I know are good through the end of this year. So prototyping and stuff like that is fine. And there's a chance I might be able to extend it. So,
as Kevin said, he has shown us the idea 6 years ago at DevCon. And people said, okay, do something. And that was it. Nothing happens. And now that the situation is much worse than 6 years ago, it becomes worse and worse in the feature set of Access. And I thought we can redo this session again in a modern style and ask again. And the first thing would be to measure the interest. Is there enough interest to do all the kind of work, to start this? Are there people who want to co-work with us to make this a reality? There are so many jobs to do and so many things to do, which the first thing is we would have to know if there is enough interest, because that was the problem the first time. Kevin tried this. So I think we are running out of time and we can do the rest in the feedback hour. Anything left urgent, Phil?
Not really urgent. There's one more question from Tom. What additional work would the Access team need to do to provide more hooks for tool vendors? And he brings up an example which is about Ivacy, and it's actually an example which is more directed to the VBA environment. And I think that is a very valid point, because I guess we could get the Access team to at least be friendly towards this project. But we might also need to involve the VBA project team, and I don't know if that would be possible. But the original question was, what would the Access team need to do to make this happen?
And I have no idea. I mean, I think, the chances of getting VB updated are slim. I think the chances of getting access to change for something like that are less slim, but still slim. I'm hoping that if we were to use this Visual Studio add-in kind of concept, that we could go into Visual Studio and say, oh, okay, I want to rip out this, file and replace it with another copy of this file. And we could automate some of that, process that maybe we don't need to have, the hooks built in.
Yeah, I can add to this point. I tried to raise the question. I asked them, are you interested in this, to the Access team 1 year ago? I didn't even get an answer. So that's, don't expect anything from Microsoft. That's my position for this. It would be nice, but I wouldn't expect anything. That's why we are talking about this here and about third parties. So, and help from the community. I wouldn't expect Microsoft to do anything. There are legal aspects, there are technical aspects, commercial, political. I wouldn't expect too much from Microsoft. And build it so that we don't need them, essentially. But I think we are really running out of time. We should stop here and go to the feedback hour.